Welcome to week 4 of our class, Transmission of the Light, the study of Keizan Zenji's Denkoroku. And today this week, we're going to look at 3 ancestors, the first of which is Yaoshan. Yaoshan, chapter 37 in the Cleary. And I will just dive right in. So the chapter begins that Yaoshan addresses Master Shuto. So we've heard of Shuto already. He's best known for 2 teachings, Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi and Song of the Grass Roof Hut. And Yaoshan asks him a very sincere question. He says, I know something about the teachings of early Buddhism, the canonical teachings, perhaps also the teachings of early Mahayana. And I've heard that, according to the Cleary translation here, in Zen, they point directly to the human mind to see its essence and realize Buddhahood. But I don't understand this. So please be so compassionate as to teach me. So he comes with a very sincere question along the lines of, I've done some study and I've heard about the potential for practice to culminate in awakening, in realization, and yet I haven't experienced that. I don't understand it. So Shuto responds by saying, being just so won't do, and not being so won't do either. Being just so or not being just so won't do at all. And what about you? So as usual, what we see is an invitation to a response. There's a statement about the true nature of things, and then there's an invitation to a response by the student. But Yaoshan didn't have any answer for that. It didn't break open his delusion. So Shuto said, well, your affinity is not here. So go see Master Mazu. And so this is an interesting shift that we hadn't seen in the prior stories of the ancestors. We see this shift toward a recognition of folks practicing not just with one teacher, but with 2 or even more. So this is a very, very interesting development because it expands the way that we understand the lineage, right? Up until this point, one could mistakenly think that there was only one transmission between each teacher and one of their students that mattered, and that was an exclusive way of transmitting a particular set of knowledge. But now we see that it's not about a particular set of knowledge, but rather that it is about a meeting of the minds, a particular set of conditions that arises between these individuals having some recognition of the Dhamma. So he goes to Mazu, and Mazu also makes a statement and invites a response. And Mazu's statement is, sometimes I make him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. And sometimes I don't make him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. Interesting. So let's look at that sentence before we go on to the next one. Sometimes I make him, and the him is in quotation marks, and Cook also does this, separates the him, so that we're clear that it's not a particular person, some other person, or even himself that he's talking about. But rather, the him stands in for Buddha nature. So sometimes I am the activity that manifests Buddha nature, just like the Buddha holding up the flower, just like Kanadeva slipping in the needle. Sometimes I am the activity that shows up, that demonstrates the principles that are already here in a way that is specific enough that we can see them. But sometimes I don't make him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. So sometimes Buddha nature shows up in ways that are not based on our intentional actions, but shows up in ways that are more surprising. Even though it's always present, it's always fully pervasive, it cannot possibly be escaped. But we haven't actually seen it until there is a particular moment where it becomes clear. And we've been looking at those moments in these stories of the ancestors. So then Mazu also makes one more statement before he invites the reply from Yaoshan. And his other statement is, sometimes raising the eyebrows and blinking the eyes is right, and sometimes raising the eyebrows and blinking the eyes is not right. What about you? So this second sentence is about the way in which the subjective dualistic understanding of right and wrong is actually part of the manifestation of Buddha nature. So Buddha nature manifests, and within that, we subjectively see some of it as right and some of it as wrong. And that is a distinction that is good to retain. We need to deal with the subjective world. We need to actually be skillful within the subjective world. And we also need to know that it's based on these principles that themselves are not right and wrong, are not divided up in this way. And so I'll give you an example of that. I'll tell you a story. There was a time when I was giving a talk and I was speaking about the suchness of phenomena, all phenomena as mere grains of sand or mere moments, mere conditions, temporal conditions. And someone raised her hand and she said, well, I don't understand how that could be true, because if you give someone an ice cream, it's not the same thing as hitting them with a stick. And in that moment, we had a discussion about it, but it wasn't until later actually that it unfolded in a deeper way. And then I've used it in several talks since then. This was a number of years back. Because the reason she was using those two examples is, in her view, giving an ice cream would be something pleasant to do. If you give someone an ice cream, that's a nice thing. That would be right. That would be on the side of right, let's say. And hitting someone with a stick would be something very unpleasant, potentially harmful, potentially violent. That would be on the side of wrong. But it depends on the causes and conditions that are present. And I'll give you an example. If you were to give someone who is lactose intolerant an ice cream, that could do them a lot of harm. That could be an act of violence or neglect in some way. That could be something that would be very unpleasant for them. So giving an ice cream would be on the wrong side. And conversely, in Zen, and this person was not a Zen practitioner, so she didn't know, but in Zen, we actually hit people with sticks for the benefit of helping them to wake up, right? There's a stick called a kyosaku. There can be small ones that are, maybe a foot long or so, and there are much larger ones that are like the size of a baseball bat, maybe 3 feet long. And they're long, narrow, flat at one end, so that you could strike someone on the shoulder muscles and that would help to release some energy, help them to relax, help them to perhaps also wake up a little bit if they're feeling drowsy. Just shift the energy during meditation. Most Zen centers in the United States don't use the kyosaku. I have practiced at places in Japan and in the States too. Yes, and in the States too, where they used the kyosaku and found it quite helpful, actually. You could actually request it in a certain way, and I would use it sometimes if I were feeling a lot of tension in my shoulders. So then hitting someone with a stick would be on the right side of the equation. So maybe you see where I'm going with this, that in the same way that Master Mazu is saying, right and wrong arises within the activity, the whole great activity that is the world and the causes and conditions that are totally interpenetrating. And that is a view, that is a subjective view that isn't embedded in the principles themselves or in even the objects themselves, but it is a resultant, if you will, of that activity and the way that we relate to constellations of particular conditions. So at these words, Yaoshan was greatly enlightened. So he realized this, you could say, this complete interpenetration of the universal principles that are at work and the great activity of arising and ceasing, presence, right, wrong, intention, raising the eyebrows, not raising the eyebrows. There's also this nuance of the blinking, so that you probably might remember that in the first case, in the story of Shakyamuni Buddha, there was this mention of his blinking. Actually, in the second case, in the story of Shakyamuni Buddha transmitting to Mahakashapa, there is this mention of him holding up the flower and blinking. And this is an echo back to that. So what about blinking? Blinking is very much like breathing, in that it is an activity that most of the time we're not conscious of. Most of the time, it's just happening. It is the activity of the body just naturally taking place. Excuse me. And then at other times, we can blink intentionally. We can actually do it on purpose. And so just as Mazu says in his first statement, sometimes you intentionally raise your eyebrows and blink, and other times that is just the activity that's happening, or that's not happening based on how the principles are arising. So he bowed, and Mazu checks him. He says, "What have you realized?" And then Yaoshan says, "I was like a mosquito climbing up on an iron ox." Or sometimes the phrase is It's changed to say I was like a mosquito biting an iron ox is the way that it shows up in some of the koans. So what does that mean? It means it's something useless. The mosquito cannot bite the iron ox. It can't nourish itself that way. So it's a mismatch, something useless. So it's a mismatch of the conditions. And Mazu said, okay, you've realized the truth, so guard it well. But your teacher is still Shuddho. So he's saying, great, you understood what I said. You have realized something. And still, you should honor that relationship with your teacher Shuddho. So then we have a bit of the backstory. And Yaoshan, we learn he went forth when he was 17, so a little bit older than some of the other folks, but very young nonetheless. And we learned this about his backstory, that he learned many scriptures and treatises and kept the monastic precepts very strictly. And so this is what was referred to in the very beginning, right? I know something, he states very clearly to Shuddho, I know something about the canonical teachings, but I really still don't understand this, meaning I haven't actually had that lived experience, that knowing it in my bones. What do they mean? What does this actually mean? What is it pointing to? And so for that reason, it says here in his backstory, one day he lamented to himself, oh, a real man, a real man should purify himself without laws. So that's Cleary's translation. I think Cook's translation is a bit better here because it's not so dogmatic in that way. In the Cook translation, we see a true man ought to purify himself apart from the laws. So that's a little bit different in my view, meaning that he has a moment of understanding that simply following the rules of the Vinaya, of the monastic lifestyle guidelines, the monastic precepts, isn't sufficient to attain realization. And that is very consistent with what we see in those canonical teachings that he would have been reading. So he has a moment of recognizing, right, just following the rules of monastic life is not going to be the path to realization. And that's an important lesson for all of you, because you may or may not be monastic. And even if you are a monastic, you may or may not be in a monastic container living a monastic life. And even if you are in a monastic container, again, there is this exhortation to know that the realization is supported by that, but that is not sufficient. That is not sufficient. So he stayed with Mazu for some time. I'm going to go back to the Cleary translation now. Yaoshan stayed with Mazu for 3 years or so. And one day Mazu asked him, how do you see things these days? So again, a checking question. And this is very classic. I will say that I experienced this with my master when I was in Japan. I think it's very, very emblematic of Zen practice. Particularly if you have an ongoing relationship with a teacher, there are these checking questions, these points. And I'll tell you a story about that. One day I was in Doksan. I went to practice encounter with my teacher, and there was there had to be an interpreter there for these practice discussions because he spoke only Japanese and I spoke only English, really, based on, we knew a tiny bit of each other's language, but not much. And in any event, I went in there and I didn't have a question. And so I said that I didn't have a question. And so, we have all these stories of the fierce Zen masters and this kind of strictness and these kind of demanding methods, exhortations, and so on. And instead of that, what happened was that Roshi, this is Seke Harada Roshi leaned forward a little bit, and in a voice almost a whisper, he said to me, "What's keeping you from waking up?" That was his checking question that day. What's keeping me from waking up? It was profound. So Mazu asked Yaoshan, "How do you see things these days?" And Yaoshan said, "Having shed my skin completely, there is only one true reality." So this has to have happened. If he's talking like this has to have happened after that encounter that we spoke about a few moments ago in speaking about the eyebrows and the eyes. So what does it mean to shed his skin completely? This is similar to the face before your parents were born. It means to have relinquished all of your personal identity, to have become someone who is no longer clinging to your personal identity, either bodily or mental. Having shed my skin completely, there is only one true reality. There is only one reality in which I am completely embedded, in which this thing is, with which this thing is completely non-separate. There is only the one reality, which is in a constant state of transformation, including this thing. Mazu's gives him very high praise, saying this accords with the essence of mind and has permeated your whole body. So again, this way of having experienced, of knowing it in your bones, of having had a visceral experience, of having touched it with the body, as we say in the early Buddhist suttas in Pali, kayena pusitva. So this is the funny part, though. So since you've come to such a realization, you should gird your loins and live on a mountain, wherever may be fitting. So who is it that goes to live on a mountain? Those are the teachers, right? And it's also related to his name. His name is Yaoshan. Shan is mountain. So the thing about gird your loins, I find that very funny. And the Cook translation is even more explicit about that part. And so maybe it's something like muster up your courage and go live on a mountain and teach people. And Yaoshan immediately says, well, who am I to be a teacher? Who am I to presume to live on a mountain? And Mazu says, you can't really just stop here. So you have to make a boat. You have to make a boat. For what? For ferrying others across to the other shore. That's a reference to the going from one shore to the other shore. Don't stay here. And he means that literally as well as figuratively. So once you have realized the Dhamma, once you have realized your Buddha nature, then the only thing to do, the only compassionate thing to do, the only possible thing to do would be to help others to do the same. Because you realize at that point as well the degree of delusion that people live in, the degree of suffering that people live in, the degree of just sheer desperation that people experience because they are not clear about themselves, about what they truly are. So to teach would be the only thing that would make sense. So he goes back to Shuto, because Mazu says you can't stay here. He goes back to Shuto, and Shuto says, "What are you doing?" And Yaoshan says, "I'm not doing anything at all." I'm not doing anything at all. So how would that be that one wasn't doing anything at all? So Shuto says, "Well, then you're just sitting idly. You're just lazing around." And he says, no, if I were sitting idly, I'd be doing something. Exactly. That would be a choice. But what he's referring to when he says, "I'm not doing anything at all," is about, again, the expression of the totality of Buddha nature. Something in which volition is, again, a mere condition, a mere phenomena. Even the volition to sit still and be lazy. So Shuto says, then what aren't you doing? And Yaoshan says, even the sages don't know. Even the sages don't know. Meaning, it's inconceivable. It's not something that I can't describe the workings of all of the universe to you. So Shuto praises him with this verse, this beautiful verse. We're living in the same place, but I don't know his name, right? Acknowledging again this inconceivability of a human life. We go along, each of us, so he's saying that they're colleagues now or peers. We go along with the flow of nature, of Buddha nature specifically, being just so. So now this goes back to his original statement, right? Being just so. Even the eminent sages of old don't know him. How could the careless rabble understand? So let's talk about this being just so, right? So at the beginning, Shuto said to him, being just so won't do. But he means being just so in the conventional sense, in the sense of just throwing up one's hands and saying, right, okay, so if I have Buddha nature and everything's perfect and interdependent and volition is really just a thing, a stuff in the midst of all that, then why do anything? I'm great, I'm perfect. But that actually is a mistake. That is what we would call a painted rice cake. It doesn't actually nourish you. It's just a conceptual understanding. So this kind of letting it all hang out, being just so, won't do. And the not being just so won't do either. And what does that mean? It means that you cannot force realization. You cannot just, it's not just a recipe. It is not something that you can simply set out to do by your intention and have it occur. There is again this kind of there is intention involved and volition, but there is also a whole myriad, an innumerable, inconceivable number of other conditions that are also present at that moment of that blossoming. And being so, or not just being so, won't do it all. So again, just kind of throwing up one's hands and saying, I'm not going to do anything, including choose to be lazy or anything. I'm just throwing in the towel on the whole thing. That won't do, right? Just not practicing. That would be the not practicing side of things. So, but now he says, we go along with the flow of nature, being just so, being truly suchness, having thoroughly penetrated it, then being suchness. You were already being suchness, but now Shuto and of course Mazu and Yaoshan, Shuto and Yaoshan, are both fully being just so, having realized being just so. So then there's a whole nother koan. So this is a very interesting story because it's just koan after koan after koan. And this is what we see in the koan collections. We see this kind of interplay, this kind of language interplay is highly, highly valued in Chinese Buddhism. Highly valued. Not because of any kind of like intellectual volley, but rather because there was a value for a form of expression that could be recognized in each other. This was the way that they demonstrated Sangha, actually. That they demonstrated their sense of community with one another. So we have this conversation about speech and activity miss the point. And Yaoshan punctuates by saying, well, silence and inactivity also misses the point, right? So again, not letting each other fall to one side or the other of the duality, but really making sure that the universal, the whole, the interpenetration is completely expressed as well. So that's where Shuto says, not even a needle can enter. So going one step further than Kanadeva, who dropped the needle in the water, not even the needle can enter in the completeness of one's understanding, one's embodiment of all things, of Buddha nature as a whole. Why? Because if it's the whole, then nothing can enter. It's the whole. And Yaoshan says, with me, it's like planting flowers on a rock, meaning that it's not something that can be cultivated or grown. It is what it is. It is simply a matter of realizing what it is. But there's no cultivation that can take place. So then Keizan gives his various commentaries here. At the top of 139 in the Cleary translation, he says, when Shuto first gave this explanation of being so, won't do, and not being so, and so on, Yaoshan still clung to the ungraspable, and therefore he didn't yet know the import of the words. It's a very interesting kind of paradoxical statement that Keizan makes there, huh? Clinging to the ungraspable. How can one cling to the ungraspable? And yet in some way, that's what Yaoshan was doing. Yaoshan was clinging, you could say, perhaps to clarify this, to his idea of the ungraspable. And then at some point, he realizes the ungraspability, the actual ungraspability. And then you can't cling because it's ungraspable. Okay. Mazu showed him how, going further down that page 139, how it differs according to the time. That's what was brilliant about Mazu's statement that helped Yaoshan to have his understanding, right? So Mazu spoke specifically about, in this moment, I'm doing this thing, and in this moment, I'm not doing this thing. And how do those two compare? In this moment, it looks like right, and in this moment, it looks like wrong. And how do those two compare? What's true about all of these things, even among those differences? That's what unlocked it for Yaoshan. Lovely. Also, I gave you some information about the koan, about the hands and eyes of the Bodhisattva, in part because I feel like that aspect is is very clearly demonstrated in Yaoshan's story, and is also a little bit potentially related to this this statement by Mazu. So you can have a look there. Also, this statement here, later on, Yaoshan sought the direct pointing to the human mind. But he was greatly enlightened when the one who raises the eyebrows and blinks the eyes was pointed out to him. And what is that one? That's the Buddha nature. You could say the universal principles of awakening at work. The universal activity of complete interpenetration, complete non-separation, emptiness, conditionality, impermanence, karma, all bundled in there. Non-self, dukkha, nirvana, it's all in there. So when he preached Yaoshan after his awakening, he said, I am speaking these words to you to reveal that which has no words. Beautiful. Beautiful. It reminds me of Dogen's comment, Dogen's statement about the use of language, because goodness knows Dogen was super excited about the use of language. And he said is like kapatsupachi. Kapatsupachi is when the sound that's made when the fish jumps out of the water. So it means we use words to escape words in the same way that the fish uses the water to jump out of the water. So this is what Yaoshan is pointing to when he says, I'm speaking these words to you to reveal that which has no words. The original face of that one has no such features as eyes or ears, right? So beautiful, because he didn't get hung up on Mazu's eyebrows or eyes, right? The specifics of what he's talking about. He understood the principle of what he was talking about. So beautiful. It's said that Yaoshan didn't have many students because he is quite strict and very austere. And at the top of 140, many people couldn't stand the hunger and the cold, but there were many enlightened monks and laymen in his group, which makes me wonder, what about the women? Were there any women? Were they just not acknowledged or recorded? Or maybe there weren't any women. I don't know. It's a curiosity. So in this middle paragraph on page 140, Kazan asks us, exhorts us, don't you see that which causes the eyebrows to raise and the eyes to blink is right and not right? Just like ice cream, just like the stick. Right and not right. That state is not to be doubted. Everyone has it. The universality again, right? The universality. It causes you to be born. It causes you to die. It causes you to move and act. It causes you to perceive and feel. It is what we call this. This, again, standing in for Buddha nature. And it causes all of these things, right? So again, it is pointing at the great activity that is taking place and how that activity is completely forming the world, the dualistic world that we know of right and wrong, the world that we know of realizing or not having realized one's true nature, the world that we know of volition and things that happen without our volition. All of that. So we come, and he asks us before the poem, are you not raising your eyebrows and blinking your eyes right now? So think about it. Think about volition and non-volition, activity, non-activity, and what pervades all of that. All right, the poem. The one who's always lively, we call the one raising the eyebrows and blinking the eyes. That is what Kazon himself refers to as his explanation of this principle. The one who is always lively.